had always known that living in a neighborhood with an HOA meant dealing with unnecessary rules and overreaching authority, but I never expected it to turn into a battle. My name is James Carter, and I'm a federal judge. I bought my home 5 years ago, drawn to the peaceful tree-lined streets, the well-kept houses, and the promise of privacy. I paid for the property in full, no mortgage, no liens, and most importantly, no contractual obligation to the HOA. My land was mine, free and clear. At first, I barely interacted with the HOA. Sure, I'd heard the complaints from neighbors, petty fines, arbitrary rules, the president's power trips, but I figured if I stayed out of their way, they'd stay out of mine. That was a mistake. The HOA president, Linda Markham, was a woman who thrived on control. She walked the neighborhood like a queen, overseeing her kingdom, nitpicking every detail. If a lawn was an inch too high, a trash can left out an hour too long, or a mailbox painted the wrong shade of beige, Linda would issue a notice. She didn't just enforce rules, she made them up. I ignored her ridiculous letters at first. Your garden disrupts the uniform aesthetic of the community. Your trees are too large compared to your neighbors. Consider redoing your landscaping to align with HOA standards. I threw every single notice in the trash. Then, one day, I came home to a nightmare. It was a long day at work. I had spent hours reviewing case files, dealing with bureaucratic inefficiencies, and presiding over hearings. By the time I pulled into my driveway, all I wanted was a quiet evening on my porch, surrounded by the towering trees that had stood on my property for decades. But the moment I stepped out of my car, my heart sank. My yard, once lush, green, and full of life, was now a wasteland. Every single tree had been cut down, not pruned, not trimmed, completely obliterated. The thick trunks that had shaded my home for years were reduced to jagged stumps. Piles of sawdust and scattered branches littered the ground like remnants of a battlefield. The rich scent of freshly cut wood still hung in the air, a sickening reminder that this had happened recently. For a long moment, I just stood there, frozen. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. No one had the right. No one had permission. And yet, the destruction was right in front of me. Then, my eyes landed on something that made my blood run cold. A white pickup truck was parked near the curb, the HOA's logo emblazoned on the side. That was when it hit me. The HOA had done this. They had trespassed onto my property and taken it upon themselves to destroy my trees, without so much as a warning. No letter, no fine, no discussion. Just raw, unchecked authority wielded with reckless abandon. A slow, icy rage crept over me. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. This was a message, a power play. Linda Markham had decided to teach me a lesson, but she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to take a deep breath. I wanted to storm into the HOA office and demand answers, but that would be too easy. No, Linda Markham needed to learn a lesson in the way that would hurt her the most, and I knew exactly how to do it. As if on cue, the driver's side door of the HOA truck opened, and out stepped Linda herself, clad in her usual pastel suit, arms folded across her chest, a smug smile plastered on her face. "Ah, you're home," she chirped, tilting her head as if she were pleased with herself. "I was wondering when you'd see the improvements." Improvements? My trees had been here for over 50 years. They were a part of this land, part of my home. And this woman had the audacity to act like she had done me a favor? I said nothing. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us, watching as her confidence faltered. Just for a second. "I know this might be a shock," she continued, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "But your yard was in violation of community standards. Overgrown, unkempt. Frankly, it was an eyesore. The HOA has full authority to enforce regulations to maintain neighborhood aesthetics." I raised an eyebrow. "Full authority?" She nodded, her smirk widening. "Of course, it's all in the bylaws. You should have read them before moving in. But don't worry, I'm sure we can resolve this like adults. Maybe even discuss some landscaping options approved by the HOA. She thought she had won. She thought I was just another homeowner she could push around. It was time to show her exactly who she was dealing with. I took a step closer, lowering my voice just enough to make her lean in. "Linda," I said smoothly, "do you know what trespassing is?" She blinked. "Excuse me. And vandalism? Destruction of private property?" I continued. "Because that's what just happened here. You didn't just enforce community standards. You broke the law." Linda scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, please, you can't be serious." I smiled. "I'm a federal judge." The color drained from her face so fast, I almost laughed. For the first time, she looked truly afraid. Her posture stiffened, and her fingers twitched, as if she wanted to grab something to steady herself. "You... what?" she stammered. I leaned in just a little closer. "And you just committed a crime in front of the one person who knows exactly how to make you pay for it." She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. The smugness, the condescension, the fake superiority, it all vanished in an instant. Linda Markham had spent years ruling this neighborhood like a dictator. But now the queen was about to fall. I walked into my study, my pulse steady, my mind razor sharp. Linda Markham thought she had all the power. She thought this was just another day of flexing her HOA authority. She had no idea she had just destroyed herself. I sat at my desk and pulled up the security footage from my property. Multiple cameras covered my front and backyard, and as I scrolled through the timestamps, my gut twisted with rage. There it was, the HOA's landscaping crew, arriving in the early morning, chainsaws in hand, no notice, no permission. The video showed them hacking down decades-old trees as if they were weeds, their careless hands dragging away the remains of my once beautiful yard. Then, the HOA truck pulled up, and out stepped Linda Markham. She strutted across my property like she owned it, nodding approvingly as my trees collapsed one by one. At one point she even laughed, gesturing to a worker as if telling him to hurry up. I clenched my jaw, inhaling slowly. Perfect. I downloaded the footage, saving it across multiple devices. The more I watched, the worse it got. The workers didn't just cut down trees, they trampled my flower beds, ripped out my garden lights, and even knocked over my mailbox. This wasn't community beautification. This was destruction, and it was illegal. I turned to my files, flipping through my home's purchase agreement. I already suspected the truth, but now I had to confirm it. 5 minutes later, I found exactly what I needed. I wasn't even under HOA jurisdiction. The boundary lines were clear. My property was on land that had never legally fallen under HOA control. Linda Markham had no authority over me. None. I let out a slow breath, my lips curling into a smirk. Now let's talk damages. I pulled up my state's laws on tree removal. I already knew they were strict, but I wanted exact numbers. Within seconds, my screen filled with legal statutes. Illegally removing protected trees, fines up to $50,000 per tree. Trespassing on private property, civil penalties up to $10,000. Property destruction, full compensation required plus damages. I counted the stumps outside. They had destroyed 12 trees. Linda Markham had just cost herself and the HOA over $500,000. And I wasn't even done yet. I started digging deeper, pulling up public HOA financial records. It took less than 10 minutes to find discrepancies. Illegal fees, embezzled funds, unauthorized special assessments with no documentation. A full-blown fraud operation hiding in plain sight. I leaned back in my chair, staring at my screen, my smirk widening. Linda Markham wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was a criminal, and I was about to take everything from her. I didn't rush. Power is best wielded with patience. Instead of confronting Linda Markham immediately, I started with my neighbors. For years, they had grumbled about the HOA's nonsense, unfair fines, absurd restrictions, and ever-rising fees. But nothing ever changed because Linda ruled with intimidation. Until now. I made my rounds, knocking on doors, laptop in hand. At first, there was skepticism, then outrage. Watching the footage of the illegal tree removal was one thing, but when I showed them the financial fraud, the anger became something more. It became action. The news spread like wildfire. By the next evening, over 30 residents gathered in my front yard, talking in hushed but furious voices. Many had their own stories: fines for ridiculous infractions, threats for minor landscaping choices, unexplained fees they were forced to pay. Enough was enough. A group of neighbors marched straight to the HOA office, demanding answers. Linda Markham wasn't ready. She emerged from her office looking pale, her usual smugness gone. "This is all a misunderstanding," she stammered, trying to pacify the crowd. The trees were removed for community beautification. It was a necessary. On private property, someone cut in. Without notice, another added. Linda's eyes darted around, searching for support, but for the first time, she had none. She cleared her throat. We acknowledge that some mistakes may have been made." Someone snorted. Another neighbor outright laughed. Then, in an act of sheer desperation, she issued an official HOA mandate. Residents were now banned from planting new trees without explicit HOA approval. That was the last straw. Shouts erupted. People pulled out their phones, filming her flustered attempt at control. The rebellion had begun. But I stayed quiet. I let the chaos build, watching Linda squirm. Because the real strike, the final blow, had yet to come. And when it did, she wouldn't just lose her position, she'd lose everything. Linda Markham thought she could control the narrative. She called an emergency HOA meeting, hoping to smooth things over, to buy herself time. She probably imagined she could gaslight her way out of this, blame a clerical error, shift responsibility onto someone else. She had no idea what was coming. I arrived at the packed clubhouse with a stack of documents, security footage, city laws, records of illegal transactions. Every piece of fraud, every mismanaged dollar, every shady fee she had pocketed, it was all there. I waited as she began her speech, her voice shaking slightly. "We understand there have been concerns, but I assure you, the HOA has always acted in the best interest of the community." I stood. "Would you like to explain this?" I placed the documents on the table. Silence. Linda's face drained of color as she flipped through the pages, her fingers shaking. A murmur spread through the crowd. People whispered in outrage. Someone read aloud. $10,000 spent on consulting fees to a company owned by Linda Markham? Another voice. Unapproved special assessments? Tens of thousands missing from the HOA reserve fund? Linda tried to interject. "This is being taken out of context." "And the fines from the city?" I interrupted. "Tens of thousands per tree. And guess who gets to pay?" A stunned silence, then chaos. People shouted over each other. Neighbors who had once been afraid now demanded answers. Linda stepped back, clutching the table, her eyes darting toward the exit. Then her phone rang. The room hushed as she answered. I watched as her expression twisted from confusion to pure terror. She hung up and turned to the board, voice barely a whisper. "The HOA's funds, they've been frozen." The government had stepped in. An official investigation was underway. The realization hit the room all at once. The HOA was finished. Linda grabbed her purse, bolted for the door, and never came back. By the next week, the HOA collapsed completely. Without funds, without leadership, and with pending legal action, it crumbled under its own corruption. Neighbors celebrated. Fences were painted the wrong color, cars were parked freely, and yes, new trees were planted. As for me, I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, watching as a new oak sapling was placed in my yard. Justice had been served, and the neighborhood was finally free. The neighborhood was finally free. With the HOA in ruins, the residents wasted no time. A new community committee was formed, one that actually listened to people. No more ridiculous fines, no more power-hungry enforcers. For the first time in years, people smiled as they walked their dogs, hosted barbecues, and painted their homes however they pleased. And Linda Markham? She vanished. Her house went up for sale almost overnight. No one saw her leave. No one cared where she went. She had ruled through fear, but in the end, she was nothing without her stolen power. I stood on my porch, watching as a neighbor helped plant a new oak sapling in my yard. It would take years to grow, but that was fine. This was never about revenge. It was about justice.